I found a hidden world under my house. It's a peeping nightmare. We finished the drive up with the last of the moving boxes early Sunday morning. It would have been Emily's birthday. Neither Hannah nor I mentioned it. But I ate a strawberry Pop-Tart for lunch since Emily loved those god-awful collisions of cardboard and sugar. On Sunday afternoon we got a visit from the neighborhood welcoming committee. Strange, cheerful people with a list of suggestions. Hannah and I thanked them. Made them coffee. Quickly forgot about everything they said. Even in a new house. The memory of Emily was a shadow that stretched cold over every room. Hannah retreated to the bedroom upstairs. I buried myself into renovations. New windows. New paint. Trying to build a fresh life around a rotting frame. I heard the whispering for the first time a few days after we were settled. My latest order was waiting for me at the hardware store. I was making a final lap around the exterior of the house looking for any damage. Potential projects. Distractions. The house was 2 stories tall. Deep ocean blue. Old with faded paint. It was a Cape Cod design. All sharp angles and bay windows. Slim white pillars lined the porch. The yard was small. Open. Shaded by oaks and drooping willows. As I passed by the crawl space I noticed 2 oddities. The first was that there was a padlock on the outside of the sheet metal door. The second was the faint sound of hissing air coming from under the house. I leaned down to listen. It almost sounded like words whispered from so far away that they became wind. The lock on the door was heavy. Dotted with rust. That close I could feel the draft slipping past the door. Cold. There was a smell I couldn't place. Dirt and water and something sweeter. Kevin? Hannah was standing on the back deck. She looked small. Wrapped in one of my flannel shirts even though the day was warm. I stood up. Something is hissing under the house. I'm going to take a look later. Could be the pipes. Okay. It's nice out. It is. Would you like to take a walk? Check out the neighborhood? I knocked the dirt off of my jeans and headed towards the deck. Can't right now. Sorry. I've got to go pick up some stuff from the store. It's a beautiful house but a bit of a fixer-upper. You know. Hannah smiled. Sure. I nodded and went inside. It wasn't her fault that she looked so much like Emily. Dark hair and hazel eyes. Sandalwood skin. Faces delicate and animate. I didn't blame Hannah for the resemblance, but I had such a difficult time looking at her anymore. Even her voice dragged the memories up. Lovely, acid and heavier than the world. Heavier than I could carry. I wouldn't avoid her forever. I promised myself it would hurt less in time. And then I could be around my wife again. I woke up that night to the sound of whispers. Hannah was sleeping next to me. I touched my phone. Blinking against the sharp blue light. It was just after 3 a.m. The whispers stopped. A long moment of silence hung heavy. Then something started to whistle outside. The sound was clear and charming. It started up the street and swept under our house. I moved towards the blinds. Wait. Hannah was awake. Still wearing my oversized flannel. Someone's outside. I said. Not sure why I was whispering. The neighbors said not to look at whatever whistled on the street at night. But. Hannah sat up. It's probably a prank. I don't look. This house. This neighborhood. Something is strange. I climbed back into bed. The whistling stopped within a minute or two after traveling the length of the neighborhood. Hannah moved closer and I held her until she fell asleep. Right before I nodded off, I thought I saw shadows begin to drift on the bedroom wall. A trick of the moonlight. I assumed. Seeping in through the closed blinds. The next morning I started on the crawl space early. I searched the house and garage for a key that might fit the padlock. Nothing. Thank God for bolt cutters. Above. A late September sun pumped out heat. I cut the lock before lunch and crawled into the cool shadows under the house. There wasn't much room between the dirt and the beams overhead. Pink insulation hung suspended from the house like artillery blasts caught in stop motion. My headlamp pushed weakly against the shadows. It was like something under the house was drinking the light. I took a deep breath and inched forward on my stomach. The air was stale and thick with dust with just a hint of asbestos. I couldn't hear any of the wind or whispers I had the day before. As I wormed my way farther inside, the distance between the dirt and the beams grew tighter. Every dozen feet or so I'd have to wiggle over a bump or around a cinder block pillar. Twice the squeeze was so tight I had to exhale to slide through. I've never been a fan of close spaces, but I can usually manage. That day, though, I began to feel a slow itch of panic roll in every time my back brushed against a beam. Coughing on the dust. It struck me that I wasn't sure why I was dragging myself through grime and crickets peep. I wanted to find the source of the whispering I'd heard twice. But more than that, I think I went under the house because there was a padlock on the door. As if I wasn't allowed to visit my own crawl space. To hell with locks and limits. At least the ones on my own property. So I slithered on deeper into the dark. Glancing back, the dull square of light that marked the entrance and exit was looking washed out. Far away. The house was large but hardly sprawling. Yet no matter how quickly I crawled, the space appeared to stretch. I stopped to catch my breath and wipe a streak of dirt from my chin. In that quiet moment, I heard it. The whispering had started again. Only this time it sounded like voices begging. A draft came in with the whispers. Cold air. The hairs on my arms shot up like soldiers at attention. I saw my breath come out as steam against the glow of my headlamp. The whispers got louder. Shadows at the corners seemed to push back against the light wherever I moved the beam. Resistant. Nearly solid. The silhouettes twisted in strange undulations. They moved from the light but snapped back the moment there was free darkness to occupy. I didn't want to be under the house anymore. Turning around to leave was harder than I expected. The dirt was too close to the beams for me to rotate. When I tried, I felt a pressure and then I was stuck. I struggled for a panic moment and pulled free, but it was enough to disorient me. The temperature continued to drop and the whispering grew louder. Crying. Nearly wailing. I looked over my shoulder for sunlight in the exit, but it was all dark. I realized there was a shadow blocking the door. Insulation above me began to rustle in the breeze, which quickly grew into a gale. A frozen winter wind was tearing through my crawl space, kicking up dust and piercing through my t-shirt and jeans. Briefly, I wondered if I'd lost my mind. Then the swing of my headlamp showed more of the dense shadows moving, drifting or sliding towards me. My confusion broke and I began to crawl like the devil himself was licking at my heels. I didn't think much about direction. Only distance. Once I got some space and came to a more open area, I would attempt to circle back to the door. Frost was forming on the cinder blocks. I squirmed and pulled, but no matter how fast or far, there was always more house over me. I stopped after more than a minute of frantic slithering. The crawl space couldn't be that large. It made no logical sense. Everything was going numb from cold. That didn't make sense either. I tried to use the rational, non-lizard part of my brain, which was still screaming at me to move. A dropping temperature and flowing air. Could be a broken AC unit or pipe issue. Maybe. That would explain the whispering, too. As for the shadows, well, something bit me on my calf muscle. The pain was between wasp sting and touching a hot stove. I kicked out and connected with nothing but air. Then I was moving again. A wild scramble. No goal in mind other than to get away from whatever unseen thing had just hurt me. Ahead of me I saw light. But it was uneven. Flickering from overly bright to barely there. It didn't matter. It was light. I moved as fast as I could. Arm after arm. There were spots of ice on the ground now and I kept slipping. Wind roared in my ears and shadows danced around the dirty concrete pillars propping up the house. It felt like being trapped inside a coffin with a thunderstorm. The square of light radiated cold. When I came close, I realized that the wind and the whispers were coming from the opening. It was a door. Smaller than the entrance to the crawl space. Set low in the dirt. I'd need to press myself into the ground to squeeze through. There was a glare. An uneasy yellow-blue that made it impossible to see through the opening. I hesitated. Pressure on my leg. Almost a grip. Peep. Peep, peep, peep. Exhaling, I made myself as small as possible and slid forward. There was resistance like pushing against rubber. Then I was through and moving fast down some kind of dirt tunnel. The walls were close, wet and cool. My headlamp barely gave off enough light for me to see directly ahead. I was heading directly into the wind. The passage got tight and I stopped for a moment to catch my breath. I considered turning around, but I thought of the moving shadows. The grip on my leg. The bite. Nothing here made sense. Maybe I was hallucinating. Some carbon monoxide leak under the house, sending my brain on a chemical roller coaster. But I didn't feel fuzzy or off. Just freaked the feep out about whatever was in my crawl space. And, buried deeper than a murdered lover under all of the dread, was curiosity. I wanted to see where the tunnel would lead. Where the wind and the whispers were coming from. So I crawled on and then climbed when the passage angled up. The earth was warm and damp. It came down in clouds and handfuls as I worked my way higher. Soon I was covered. There was so little room. I had to fight my way forward inch by inch. Squeezing. My world turned into dirt. Instead of crawling, I was digging. I could taste soil. No room. No air. It was like drowning in dust. Then I broke free and gasped in cold night air. I drank it in ripping fistfuls of earth away until I could see a sky full of drifting stars. Earth pressed in all around me. I was half buried in a hole in the ground. My first thought was that I'd crawled out from under the house and come up in the yard. But the stars. A sky full of moving constellations. Floating slowly like ice in a stream. It was morning when I'd gone into the crawl space. How could it be night now? And why did the stars above look so unfamiliar? The sound of wailing crashed over me. Broken notes. Begging and screaming, full of need and animal panic. I scrambled out of the hole. As my eyes adjusted to the dark, I realized I was nowhere near my home. Instead, I was standing alone in the largest cemetery I'd ever seen. Tombstones and markers lay half buried for acres and acres. A moon, much larger than the one I knew, came out from the clouds, and I saw iron fences and a forest of trees in the glow. Hanging from the branches were dozens, hundreds of bodies. All of them crying out. Their voices were the wailing I heard under the house. I said out loud, brushing dirt from my face. This isn't. You're not real. Wind came and brushed the bodies until they swayed against their ropes. The movement seemed to cause them pain, and the moaning grew louder. Clouds drifted in front of the moon again, choking off the light. I was left in near black, surrounded by dead stones and dying things. Then a single bright point caught my eye. A red-orange shape came towards me. It flickered, and I thought of the glow I'd seen under the house. Like flames. Closer and closer. The figure came until I saw it wasn't a single source of light but countless glowing points. Candles. Something built like a massive man covered in candles was approaching me. I stood, dumb, rooted to the spot as it approached. It was a rotting thing. Raw muscle and bone. White wax candles poked through its skin like nails in a board. Others flickered inside, casting shadows from the creature's ribcage, its spine, its stomach. The monster was dragging a rope with a weeping woman on the other end. She looked nearly as decayed as her captor. I'd assume she was a corpse if not for her unintelligible wailing. I couldn't speak. Barely managed a wheeze. The candle thing turned to me. It had amber eyes that reflected the light. The woman on the rope began to scream and thrash. My shock broke and I yelled, stumbling back. After the third or fourth step, I felt my foot slip. The hole I'd crawled out of. I'd forgotten. Overwhelmed by the nightmare all around me. The creaking ropes and sighing bodies. I fought to keep my balance, but the earth was loose. I felt a tremendous pressure on my wrist. The candle thing had closed the distance between us. It grabbed me and its grip was freezing. I kicked and kicked and kicked, yanking back as hard as I could. Then I was falling. Climbing up. There didn't seem to be enough space to breathe. But falling down? There was plenty of room to bang and bump and bash myself senseless. I choked on soil and dust, clawing for any handhold I could find. At some point I got turned around. It felt like I was falling up. Then I came crashing back, finally landing on my back hard enough to kick the air out of my lungs. When I opened my eyes I saw cobwebs. Well, I barely saw anything. It was so dark. Everything ached. I felt like I'd fallen down a staircase and landed in a pile of bricks. For a few minutes, all I did was lay and breathe. There was a strong odor of dirt and mold. I was back under my house. As the realization sunk in, fear came in its wake. What if the biting creature was still down here? What if the candle thing could? Adrenaline is nearly magic. I was on my belly, moving in an instant. For a terrible span of seconds I had no sense of direction. Then I caught sight of a spot where the darkness was only dim. A square of light. The door to the crawl space. I pulled myself out and away. Standing up in my backyard. Daylight. Soft layers of sun and fresh air washed over me. Out there under a mid-morning sky. The nightmare place with the nooses seemed absurd. Maybe there was a gas leak? I'd nearly convinced myself it wasn't real until I saw the bruise on my wrist. Dark indigo already. I could clearly make out the impression of long thin fingers. My skin was cold to the touch everywhere the bruise covered. Over the sound of my rough breathing, I heard noise drifting out from the still open crawl space. I moved closer, careful to keep enough distance where I could run if something emerged. When I closed my eyes and listened, the sound became clear. It was the distant creaking of ropes. Leave a like and a comment if you liked the video. Check out more Reddit related video. I am posting them daily. Subscribe to see more Reddit content.